Okay. I went back and was looking at what it was me about last week. So I have decided to redo it, which I've redone quite a bit of it at this point. I'm very excited about it because this is the first time I think I'll ever be able to get through the law of sacrifice in a way I actually understand it from start to finish. So I'm going to start over with it and because we're not very far into it and redo this and see what we can do. Just chapter 7, not the whole thing. And start what we can do with it to make it better so that everybody can understand it. It's pretty exciting now that I kind of figured out what the error of my ways were. So today what I'm going to do is teach a lesson called the Documentary Hypothsis. It is based on the work of Umberto Moshe David Cassuto. I would like to tell you about this man. He was born in 1883 and he lived to 1951. He served as chief rabbi of his, which I guess is in Italy, right? From 1914 to 1925. In 1925, he became professor of Hebrew language and literature at the University of Florence, and he subsequently assumed the chair of the University of Rome, where he began to catalog the Hebrew manuscripts in the Vatican. In 1938, he was appointed to the chair of Bible studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Cassuto is one of the founding fathers of literary analysis of the Pentateuch. You have to say it that way because there were some people who preceded him, but they were not successful. He is the first one who and argued it far better than anyone else. So I think that I probably should have taught you guys about this a long time ago because it is so prevalent in uh, Bible schools to this day. It's still as false as a teaching can be, and yet is still so prevalent in the universities. Anyway, the introduction of this book was written by a man named Joshua A. Berman. He teaches Bible at Bar Ilan University and is an associate fellow at the Shalom Center in Jerusalem. He is the author of a book called The Temple, subtitled Its Symbolism and Meaning Then and Now. I can tell you he is a very good writer. All I've read of him is the introduction to this book, but I will be getting that book. I can guarantee you that because his introduction was so well written. It's very good. Anyway, I'm going to take you through some of this stuff, just enough to get you to understand what is going on here and so that you'll know what to avoid in your studies. Quoting from the book, it says, a mature science, according to Kahn's hypothesis, is one in which there exists a dominant paradigm. Already, you should know there's a problem. This man said a pure science is one in which there exists a dominant paradigm. Science is one in which there exists a dominant paradigm. In other words, science is only pure if we're studying to prove that which we already believe. That's exactly what's being said. He goes on, a conceptual framework that informs the scientist of what to expect as he engages in his or her scientific inquiry. It delineates the parameters of what can and cannot be considered acceptable solutions. What's going on in the media today? Then he goes on, and only that which conforms to the paradigm is deemed true. They're going to set a truth, and nobody else is lied that truth. Do you see a problem with what this man is proposing, right? Not Cassuto, but this man Kahn. All right, it goes on. Paradigms introduce a sociological factor into science. Oh, yes, they do. That is a true statement. To practice science is to engage the mysteries of the natural order not in unmediated fashion. It's to engage it, but not in unmediated fashion. In other words, it has to be controlled. But through the lens of the paradigm, of course, itself a human construct, no doubt. This dogmatic aspect determines who is considered in the scientific community and who is out. But he points out that because the old paradigm is but a human construct, it is subject to human foibles. How do you pronounce Foibles? Donna?
Foibles.
Foibles?
Foibles.
To be foiled?
Yeah.
Is that? Okay. Human foils. Let's just say it that way. The notion that the received text of the Pentateuch, that's the first 5 books of the Bible, Penta 5, had a prehistory. The notion that the first 5 books of the Bible had a prehistory that consisted of smaller, earlier documents had been in currency in France and Germany since the mid 18th century. So it's the mid 1700s. He says scholars had hypothesized about the existence of these documents on the basis of apparent duplications, repetitions, and contradictions. So here's what he's saying. He's saying that in the mid 1700s, now this has not existed before this time, but in the mid 1700s, some boneheads, did I say that part out loud? Idiots, no, that's maybe too hard. No, it's not. Some idiots decided that there were too many duplications, too many repetitions, and too many contradictions. Basically, and repetitions were the contradictions. They thought there were too many. So there must have been smaller versions of the first 5 books of the Bible, and thus they started to blend these things together. And that's why it repeats itself so often, the duplications. And that's why there's so much repetition. And that, of course, causes contradiction. It just pulled it out of the air, and somehow it became anybody outside that paradigm just needed to take their little low self on down to the woods and get away from everybody in town because theirs was not the accepted truth. Above all, it says, it supplied a rash edifice tracing the historical evolution of the received text. As if he's saying that their belief was that this so-called received text, the Masoretic text, no doubt, came about as it was put together over a period of time by a period of people who we don't know, with documents we've never seen, and on it goes. Right? They're getting way out there. They're saying each of the 4 source documents that when it started off, there were only 4. Eventually, there's a bazillion, but it started off with 4 basic documents. He claimed reflected a distinct stage not only in the development of the text, but more importantly, in the development of the religion of ancient Israel. In other words, God didn't know what he was doing. Moshe didn't know what he was doing, and Moshe would start writing something down and be like, over in Babylon, they do this and this, so we'll put that in there. And over in Egypt, they do this and this, so we'll put that in there. And over in America, the Indians are doing this and this. Oh, wait, they don't exist yet. But Mesoamerica, no, we can't get the Incas or any of them guys. They didn't exist either. There had to be somebody over there, so they did this and that. And somehow Moshe knew about all these different languages, all these different customs and cultures. Anyway, so here's what your documents are. It was called the J document. Wow, because they had a J back there in Hebrew, right? Say it with me. No, that's not right. There was no J, but it's called the J document. The earlier of the 4 was the account that had been formulated by scribes, not Moshe, but scribes of the court of Judea. Then they had the E document, had been produced by their rivals in the northern kingdom following the fall of Samaria in the late 8th century BCE. Wow. So now there's nothing left of Moshe at all. The D document, comprising most of the book of Deuteronomy, had been composed by scribes in Judea in the time of Joshua toward the close of the First Temple period in the late 7th and early 6th century BCE. And then there was the P document, had been authored by temple priests earlier on the Second Temple era BCE. So right around 100 to maybe you could push it back 200 years before Yeshua. And I think that's been very generous. Each document claimed, this is the name of the bonehead who did this, was characterized by its own theory, politics, language, and style. Wow. In other words, it was a human thing. It came about through human interaction, and God had nothing to do with it. In the present work, and this is what they teach in the Christian and even in the Jewish, some Jewish colleges. In the present work, originally published in 1941, this work here, where it's going to lead to, I'm still just in the introduction. But this book, his work on the documentary hypothesis, was first published in 1941. Cassuto acknowledges that his counter theory represents a challenge to the existing paradigm. Cassuto proposed back because it's 1941, that the increasing atomization and fragmentation of the biblical text be reversed. Instead, the Pentateuch had to be construed as a carefully constructed whole. So what Cassuto's saying is, hey, listen, boneheads, you got this backwards. This is not the compilation of 4 or 5 or 12,000 different things that were piled together. Nobody knew what they were doing. It's just all thrown together, and now we can't rely on it, because that's really what it comes down to, right? If we can make it a bunch of fragments thrown together that are basically crap, then we can say, hey, you can't rely on that. And Cassuto comes in and says, nope, that's not what the evidence shows. Why don't we take a look at the evidence and see what it says? Because that's kind of what scientists do, right? Claiming that this is science-based theory. Anyway, what had been construed as repetition, regression, and variance, literary tools simply convey polyphonous meaning. Polyphonous, isn't it? Polyphonous meaning, which means oneness of meaning. It's no, wait a minute. Poly is multiple, right? Yeah, so it's multiple meaning. Cassuto saw with the Torah the literary devices of harmony. Wordplay is I was using words I don't even know what those words mean. But basically, he's talking about different literary devices, if you will, that are used in putting this thing together. So he's saying that Cassuto saw a consistency here that they were missing. They more fully and consistently accounted for the very phenomenon that the source critics themselves had sought to explain. In a sentence, Cassuto represents a pivotal figure in the paradigm shift in modern biblical studies from source criticism to literary criticism. And that's really important when we talk about what the difference is. Source criticism is what led to this. They tried to say there's problems with the material itself, and that's because they thought that one here and another source came from there and another source, and on it goes, because it started off with 4 sources, and eventually people just kept coming along and writing new doctoral thesis after new doctoral thesis, breaking it down further and further and further, because they would make the claim that, well, the J, for instance, only used the word Yahweh, which of course they're saying Jehovah. That's why it's J. And then the D only used whatever it used. And then somebody else comes along and says that's not true. There's Elohim in the J source and El in the J source, and on and on. They started finding problems with what these people were saying. So these people were criticizing this, breaking it up into a source that didn't exist. They just made it up. They just said, oh, there was pre-sources to this, and it's all scrambled together. And so their arguments are about the source, not the document itself, not how do you put that, the literature. They're not criticizing the literature. They're finding problems with the literature because of their belief in another source material. And what Cassuto is saying, look, if we go in and we take a critical look at the self, what we're going to find out is that there are no problems with it. That it is, I would say, a mono, a singular work, not a poly work. Anyway, Cassuto argued the variation in divine names within a single work was commonplace in the literature of the biblical period, not just in the Bible itself. He's saying that the variation in divine names, okay, there's something wrong with what he just said, in that he says he's basically saying there are more than one divine name. Cassuto argued that. He is wrong. This guy is therefore wrong. There is only one name for God. That is Yahweh. There is no other name. But because they see a place where you could put the word Yahweh in place of Elohim. Now, you can't put the word Yahweh in place of Elohim every time, because sometimes Elohim is speaking about false gods, right? And so you're not going to replace that with Yahweh. But in the places where the 2 words could be used interchangeably, they then see that as a name of God. No, it is not a name of God. It is a title. So you can call somebody by their title, or you can call them by their name. You can call me Dr. Allen, or you can call me Mr. Allen, right? It's the same type of thing. That doesn't give me 2 names. So anyway, their argument there is very wrong. But anyway, as we go through it, because that's the only exception I saw to any of this, was that they're wrong about that. All right, so it says, Cassuto argued that the variation in divine names with a single work was commonplace. Using Elohim or El or Yahweh was commonplace. And it was. You found this in a lot of other sources from the time period, so it is commonplace. Whereas source critics had assumed that authors of all ages would never digress and would neither repeat nor contradict themselves. What? Who could do that on purpose? I'm just saying. If you're writing more than a couple of paragraphs, you're going to make that mistake, if it's a mistake. Cassuto demonstrated that these premises imposed canons of modern literary conventions upon bodies of literature to which they were entirely foreign. In other words, they're creating rules for something that doesn't have those rules. You're saying, oh, well, this can't be possible in Hebrew, so if we find it in Hebrew, then it's wrong, right? There are mathematical equations that science has had a problem with for many, many years, because the answer to the mathematical question is, and some of you will know what I'm talking about. I'm not going to say what it is just for the sake of being mean, but the answer to the equation is infinity. Well, they don't like infinity. So they make up this rule that the answer cannot be infinity. Therefore, the equation is wrong. Okay, so that's what they've done here. They've said, look, that can't be right. So we're saying it isn't right when we find it. Instead of realizing they're wrong, they're telling everybody in the world who will listen to them that these are now mistakes. They've made up these new rules that are completely incorrect. And now when they find something that violates their rule, that something, in this case, the Bible, is wrong. Anyway, it's been shown that many phenomena that were fodder for the source critics have emerged in the temple scrolls found at Qumran, a work universally attributed to a single author. In other words, we now have powerful external evidence that a single author used more than one title for God. Sometimes he called him Yahweh in these works. Sometimes he called him Elohim. Sometimes he called him El Shaddai. Sometimes he called him El. All kinds of names, right? And this one man who wrote this stuff from Qumran did exactly the same thing that these exegetes, as Kasuda likes to call them, made it rule against. So this is absolute proof that their rule is bogus. Most significantly, he notes that when a particular divine name appears out of place in a document, the source critics fail to see this anomaly as a flaw in their theory. In other words, they're making up this law, and when they're seeing it in this book, they're saying they're failing to see that no, that's a flaw in your theory. You're wrong. Anyway, he says something in here that I thought was funny. Wellhausen wrote in 1901 that this is the quote, our vital concern is research without presumptions. Research without presumptions. Research that does not find what it is supposed to find according to considerations of purpose and relevance, but what seems correct to the conscientious researcher from a logical and historical point of view. It's an oxymoron. He's talking out of both sides of his mouth. First, he starts off saying it's our concern is research without presumption, and then next he says you can't have a conclusion without a presumption. Well, you can't research without presumption. Therefore, you can't have a conclusion. Anyway, it's an oxymoron, and Wellhausen himself said it. For Romanticism, every cultural phenomenon, primitive phase analogous to childhood, a classical phase analogous to adulthood, and a decadent phase analogous to senility. Thus, for Wellhausen, E was the theological advance over the earlier, more primitive J. These texts were thought to reflect spontaneity and spirit, bearing out the romanticist belief that the primitive is the most sublime. By contrast, the work of the priest in P, the latest of the documents, was taken to mark a decadent stage in the religion of Israel with its attention to ritual laws. It's a real clever way of saying that we need to get rid of the law because it's bad and prior to the law was good. Okay, so this John Van Seters has recently demonstrated that the very notion of a redactor of the type Wellhausen envisioned is anachronistic. Such redactors belong only to the age of print. I hope you got that. Then it goes on. For many in the field, the effort to critically and scientifically refract the sources of the Pentateuch from its received whole is the textual equivalent of attempting to unscramble an egg. Did that make it clearer? I love this guy. I don't know who this guy is. This is Joshua Burnham. He is a great writer. He's so funny. He said, for Wellhausen, the spirit and good acts of the prophets are to be celebrated. By contrast, the laws vital for the structuring and ordering of community are relics of the Israelite religion's decadent phase. Can you believe that? For classical Jewish theology, the Masoretic text represents the revealed, immutable Word of God. Wow. So the original isn't infallible, inerrant, and inspired. It's the one that came along several thousand years later. Does that sound familiar to anybody? All right, let's see. The earliest major academic assaults on the documentary hypothesis came from two traditional Jewish scholars, Umberto Cassuto and Bino Jacob. Well, if he's Jacob, he would be anyway. Their opposition to the hypothesis was not rooted in adherence to doctrinal orthology, in proposing the paradigm shift toward a system of analysis that focused on the unity of the text. However, they espoused a new paradigm that may be demonstrated to be fundamentally Jewish in orientation. In other words, the reason why these guys aren't getting it is because they're Christians and they don't understand anything Jewish. And Cassuto and this Bino are both saying not so much. They don't understand it because they're not Jewish. For classical rabbinic Judaism, the biblical text itself is the vehicle of revelation. For classical rabbinic Judaism, the biblical text itself is the vehicle of revelation. You guys remember a guy, his name was Shaul ben, who was his teacher? Gamliel. Shaul ben Gamliel. He once said that he received his understanding of the Bible his understanding of theology, I should say, via revelation. Okay? And the people who read his works, not being Jewish and not understanding anything Jewish, they read that and say, so the third person of the Christian Trinity that didn't exist while he was alive was filling his head with knowledge. None of it makes any sense. Yeah, okay, there's a statement there that I don't think is right, but I'm not positive, so I'm going to skip over that. Now we're going to get into the things that Cassuto said. Hopefully, if I can find it. All right, that's the halfway mark. That's pretty good. Okay. The purpose of this is not to take you through this in any great detail, but to make sure you fully understand these things that are happening here, because you're going to be faced with it at some point. Some know-it-all person is going to try to throw this, well, but the J document and the D document, blah, blah, blah. You're going to know what kind of bonehead you're dealing with. All right, so Casuto said, one of the most important attributes of science is its perpetual restlessness.
That's not what the well has.
Well is all about, no, we got to have narrative. Wellhausen's got to have narrative. Casuto just said narrative's not a good idea. He goes on, the structures that it builds for itself with stones quarried by analysis and arranged architecturally by synthesis, resplendent palaces of the human intellect are not destined to endure forever. Okay, so it's a real cheesy thing he's doing here. I do mean cheesy. But he's got a point. All right, sometimes that one of these edifices, so we've built this thing, we've built this building. You either build it on sinking sand or you build it on a stone, right? But he takes it further and he said, look, there's more to it than that. Even if you build on stone, if the pillars that you're using are made of sandstone that are prone to decay, what's going to hold your roof on, right? And eventually it's going to cave in. So there's more to it than just building on the stone slab. Your materials have to be better than that. So that's all he's doing. It's real hokey what he's doing. Sometimes it happens that one of these edifices, which for a given period was distinguished for its strength and stability and its capacity to withstand ordinary winds and even extraordinary storms, begins in the course of time to totter and inclines to fall, be it because the ground on which it was erected was not sufficiently solid, or because the work of the builders was not done well. I guess I left out the part where it talks about the materials not being any good. He goes on, then it behooves us to abandon the building and to continue our way forward until we succeed in finding a fitting site on which to establish a new structure in place of the old. So he's just basically saying, look, yours didn't work. It's fallen apart at the seams. The proof is in the pudding. Now that we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, you don't have a leg to stand on. So let's, instead of trying to hang on to this building, instead of trying to prop it up with more structure, trying to pour a floor after the fact or whatever it is, instead of doing that, why don't we just maybe start from scratch? So this theory that we've been talking about is called the theory of documents. So it's not the documentary hypothesis, that's Casuto's work, but the theory of documents, and that is the J document, the P, the D, and whatever the other one was, E. Yeah, for Elohim. All right, so he goes on. The Torah was compiled in the period of the Second Temple from various documents or sources. Okay, that's the argument, is that it was compiled during that time. The Torah was compiled in the period of the Second Temple from various documents or sources. Okay, yeah, so they're saying these sources came from around the period of the Second Temple. They were put, but some of them would have existed prior to that, though this is when all of this, the argument is that they came together. It goes on, the Jowist, the J document, so they're called Jowist, which use the name Yahweh. Actually, they use the name Jehovah from the beginning of the story of creation. Another source, E, or the Elohist, in other words, Elohim, according to which the Tetragrammaton was first revealed to Moses, and hence it employed the designation Elohim. Okay, well, suppose you could say that. In all the narratives preceding the revelation of God to Moses on Mount Horeb, a third was P, or priestly code, which emanated from priestly circles and also refrained from mentioning the name Yahweh before the generation of Moses, which is not true, of course, but that's what they said. A fourth source, which comprises the main part of the book of Deuteronomy. So now you know why they're called these things. Okay. this guy in 1924 in the Zeitkreist für die, I don't do German real well, Altes Wissenschaft, the leading periodical for biblical studies in Germany, the editor H. Gressman wrote the following, and this is what happens when false doctrine becomes infallible. This is what he wrote. We must stress with the utmost emphasis that there is no school of biblical scholarship today that is not founded on the critical analysis of the sources in the Hexateuch, that is, the Pentateuch and the book of Joshua. And anyone who does not accept the division of the text according to the sources and the results flowing therefrom has to discharge the onus if he wishes to be considered a collective scientific work, a proving that all the research work done until now was futile. Wow. So he's saying if you don't agree with us and you're saying that we're wrong and that everything that we've done is futile, phooey on you. Possibly these words, Casuto said, were written just because it was already felt that the new epoch of ferment in biblical criticism was beginning, because the winds of change were already happening and this guy was trying to put a stop to it. It's basically what he's saying. Although the attitude appears daring, yet the method of their investigation still resembles the controversial approach, and their contributions are of limited originality. Okay, so here he's talking about the people who were actually trying to dispute it but did not do a very good job early on. At least I think that's who that is. And in the works of... All right, so there was this thing in the approach to the Bible, and this was across the board. Christians did this, and the Jewish scholars did this as well. Not all of them, but there were a number of them. They would do this comparison of the works of Homer, speaking of the Iliad and the Odyssey, those two works, which Casuto himself does, and then the epic poetry of he says, the Indians, and the studies made medieval European poetry. In other words, they're comparing the Greek with the Hebrew. They're doing a comparison contrast, which is okay to some degree, but I don't know about that. I don't think that's the greatest idea a person can have. But he said that was the first step in the development of the exegetical system. Exegesis, right? The initial attempt to analyze the sources of the Pentateuch was made by the Protestant priest Witter in a book that was published in Hildesheim in 1711. As a result of his studies, the first chapters of the book of Genesis, Witter came to the conclusion that prior to the Torah, there existed ancient poetic compositions that served as source for Moses. Witter's treatise did not have the good fortune to enjoy wide publicity and was forgotten after a time. However, there was a French physician whose name was Astruc, 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 I guess is how you say that. And when he wrote his thing, he named it, the first word in it was conjectures, which is the same title that Hildesheim used. Hildesheim, I think. Astruc was not actually an expert in the subject, but yeah, his took off like wildfire. His work has come to be considered the primary foundation of the new exegesis, and has gained for Asterisk the honor of being called the father of the documentary hypothesis. Well, anyway, case of Homer's writings, the earliest foundations of the new concepts were laid by the French dilettante, I think is how you say that. Dilettante, I don't know. Abbé de Albignac, I don't know, who was in consequence likewise given the title father of the Homeric problem. He too that Homer's poems are not unitary compositions, but collections of poems that were originally wholly unrelated. So you can see the Western Greek influence on why the Christians and why even the Jews began to follow this type of thinking, began to believe that there were previous works, because this was no new thing. They've been doing this for a very long time in the scholarly world. And Casuto's coming in and saying, wow, this is not a good idea. This is a bad thing. He says the French amateur was followed in each subject by a German professional scholar who transformed the Frenchman's opinions into a completely systematic theory. This guy Eichhorn, who published the first edition of his work, and the other guy Wolff, whose treatise blah 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 appeared in 1795. So those are the two guys, the two actual scholars who took the two. What do we call those guys that are self-taught amateurs that are outside their realm? Theologians. Only these guys weren't doing anything theological, but when it's theological, when somebody teaches themselves something in theology and anoints themselves knower of all things Bible and should be out there for some God unknown reason teaching, that person is called a theologian, an amateur. It's a fancy word for an idiot. So he's saying that these idiots propose these crazy ideas, and then some theologian came along and made them very popular. And this is the same thing that happened with Wellhausen. I think you guys follow what I'm saying. Okay, now we have this thing, the documentary hypothesis. First there was the documentary hypothesis. There arose a biblical exegesis, a new thesis called the theory, because it started off with the theory of writings as if they were complete writings, and then it became the theory of fragments so that they could break it down and make excuses for the reasons why their rules were falling apart. That's the whole reason for that. According to this theory, the Torah was composed of many scrolls that had at first existed independently. Then there was the supplement hypothesis. This was by a guy named Stalin and Ewald, who's a guy that I've talked about before. They postulate an ancient basic document, which laterly completed by various additions and through the process of number of redactions. So what this one is, the supplement hypothesis, is that it was written and then later people came in and added to that. Okay, before I go any further, that actually happened with the Bible. If you're reading in the Psalms, it'll say, and David went in and added this to the book of the law. And by the way, the law back then, even Jews don't seem to know that. The Tanakh is more modern. It's something that came way after the Tanaitic period. probably closer to the Dark Ages when it began to be called the Tanakh. But there was a time when the entire Hebrew Bible was called the Torah. So when it says that he added it to the Torah, which is I think the way it's put, I'd have to look, it's talking about he added to the Psalms, or he wrote it to the Book of Kings, actually I think is where that is. But you get the idea, though, is that if it's saying that it's added to the Torah, does not mean that it was necessarily added to the first 5 books. But it could have been, depending on who's doing what and why. So this idea is not all that out there. Ewald and these other guys, now these are real scholars at this point. These are guys that knew their stuff. They were wrong at times. They got off on some tangents. Yes, they did. Just like I have. I mean, every good scholar does that because we follow what's placed in front of us. We follow it to its conclusion and eventually find out that, the things that we shared with everybody before we got to the conclusion, maybe weren't so right. So it happened to him. And I'm not trying to take away from these guys, though Kasuto kind of is here, because they were talking about they were using this as part of the reason, to prop up the idea of 4 sources or more, if you will. And so I have to be with Kasuto on that and disagree with Ewald and those other guys. I don't know if it's Ewald or Ewald. It's Ewald. However that's supposed to be pronounced, I don't know. So anyway, they said that it started off as one document and people just kept adding to it and redacting it and things like that. I do not buy that, especially not on the Torah itself. I don't. It's too well put together for that to be the case. But there are places in the Bible where people like David and Shlomo actually added to it. It says it right in the book. So you can't say that that didn't happen. So the basic foundation for it, there was a reason for Ewald to think that this was a possibility. All right, a similar view with reference to Homer in his treatise De Interpolobius Homeri. Okay, let's see. Okay, he's saying, now we're talking about the comparison contrast of the Greek and the Hebrew, right? It will suffice to note that the analytical method developed in the 2 branches of learning on similar lines, particularly to technique of study, repetitions and duplications, contrasts and contradictions, linguistics and stylistic variations, and the like. And it led in both fields of investigation to the minutations and successive dissections, the verses being subjected to a microscopic examination. It just got to the point where it was beyond ridiculous. What now are we to deduce from the parallelism that continues from one generation to the other? In part, of course, it is to be explained as a result of reciprocal, good Lord, I'm trying to read that right to left, reciprocal influence, and in part also as due to the general processes in the methods and techniques of research, which is common to all humanistic studies and in time enables all these branches of learning to develop equally. And this is the problem that I've had with the New Testament letters and the problem I have with explaining what I've done. Because when you're writing a doctoral thesis, one of the things that you're supposed to do is say, well, so-and-so said this, and so-and-so said that, and so-and-so did this, and so-and-so did that, and 3% of these people came up with this conclusion, and 17% came up with that conclusion. You're supposed to do a statistical analysis. Well, I come into this and say, I can't follow any of that. They all are based on a false reality. They start off, first off, thinking that Christianity actually connects to the New Testament letters. No, they don't. No, period, end of story. They do not. They cannot. They do not. They did not. After he won his war, they did not follow Christianity. They followed Mithra. Just look at the buildings, the churches that are all around that area, all those churches are now what are called churches, were built on top of temples built in the time of Constantine to Mithra. If you look at the Arch of Constantine, there is not one single Christian marking on it. Why? Because it didn't exist while he was alive. That came around toward the end and after his death. So when you look at the Arch, it's all stuff about Mithra, the sun god. And when he changed the day to Sunday, what did he call it? He called it the Venerable Day of the Sun, Mithra worship. So there is no connection except to say that philosophers from that time period were taxed by was Constantine to develop a universal religion. Now, the word in Latin for universal is Catholic, so they eventually called it the Catholic religion. You see how all of that came about? None of that existed in writings. So when you go in and you start writing dissertations about the Christians of the first century and about the Jewish roots of Christianity, no, there is no connection. You cannot use the word Christian in the New Testament. You cannot use the word Christ for that matter, or Christianity, because none of that existed. The word Christ, Christian, Christianity, none of the church, none of those words even existed in that. If you were a follower of Mashiach, you were a Jew, born, raised, and you were Jewish until the day you died. You went to the synagogue and they didn't know who you were. They didn't, unless you told them that you believed in Yeshua, they had no way to know, none whatsoever, because you look like a Jew. You would have had these little things that I'm having here that I'm surprised nobody's made mention of. I was dared and I did it. You would have not been wearing a kippah because they didn't have that back then. You would have been wearing a talit almost exactly like the one I have on, because that is what we found I wasn't there. What has been found in the archaeological digs, right? You would not have had a zitziot tied up in knots representing the 613 laws. That did not exist back then. But they would have had zitziot, and they would have been white with a single blue thread. Yes, whether you were a believer in Jesus or not, you would have had the blue thread. So, because that's what the Bible commanded that God's children do, and they did that back then. That's a Dark Ages thing, got rid of that. But anyway, so I can't go in there and use the works of these men who built their works on a false foundation. I can't use their approach. I can't use their information. I cannot give you a statistical analysis of it. And this is the same thing that Casuto was faced with back in 1941. He had the same problem for a different reason, of course. He was trying to work of the Bible itself was very consistent and very right on. So I see that I'm almost out of time. So let me try to pull some things together here. He said, it behooves us to conduct our investigation without prejudgment or anticipatory fear, but to rely on the objective examination of the texts themselves and the help afforded ancient East. Is something wrong, Donna? Okay. All right. Let me bring this down to this one area. Here it is. On page 24, Casuto breaks this down very, very succinctly. But basically, it boils down to this. He says that the prophets, the prophets, they do not use the word Elohim, and they do not use the word Yahweh. The prophets didn't do it except for one place. The second part of Isaiah uses the word El, which isn't exactly the same thing. So the rule stands. You don't use Elohim and you don't use Yahweh. And the only place that they ever used El was just in the second half of Isaiah's prophecy. It's the only one time. And then the narrative literature uses Elohim. So if it's telling a story, God is creating the heavens and the earth, and he said, let there be. You read the word Elohim because it's a story, it's narrative. So if it's narrative, we use the word Elohim. The prophets don't use that. Where do you see it? Well, you see it in, well, you don't see it among the Kohanim, the laws. They don't use it in the laws per se. I mean, yeah, you'll find it where the laws are written, but they're not using it in. Yeah, they are. Oh, yes, they do. I guess what I read earlier was wrong because I'm thinking, yeah, they do. Because it's always saying a sweet smelling savor to who? To Yahweh. So when they're speaking of God and want to call him by name, that's when they use Yahweh. When they're talking about God in a story, they call him because it's narrative. And then the prophets don't use it at all. It's that simple. And it worked throughout the entirety of the Bible. It worked throughout the entirety of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It worked throughout the Assumption of Moshe. I've translated that myself, and it works there as well. You find it in the works of Josephus, without a doubt. I don't know if I'd be so bold to say that about Philo, but I bet you it's the same with Philo. So basically, everything from the time of the writing of the first 5 books of the Bible, what we now call the Torah, to the point of the Second Temple, Cassuto has noted in all of those writings, it comes out exactly the same. So it's not a conglomeration of 4 different or thousands of different, what am I looking for? Fragments. It's a coherent work that was done purposely. The repeating and the redundancy, there is a reason for it. And we're going to start on Leviticus chapter 7 next week. And as we work through this Leviticus, we're going to start to finally, I think, understand what the repeating is about, what were those words that he used? There was 3 or 4 different things he kept saying. So I've already forgotten them. Oh, darn. I wish I wouldn't have. Oh, man. There were the repeats, the things that they thought were mistakes. Do you remember what I'm talking about? Man, we're totally out of time. Anyway, if you're going to be truly scientific and you're truly find out what the truth is, you cannot go into it with preconceived ideas. You cannot go into it deciding before you get there that, well, I'm a Christian, so I'm going to make it Christian. You can't go in there and say, well, I'm a Jew, so I'm going to make it Jewish. No, you have to let that text tell you what that text says. And it has to be done within the time frame. In other words, if that text that we're about to study was written in the 1st century CE, you shouldn't be tying modern stuff to it. You shouldn't be tying stuff from the 1500s BCE shouldn't be tied to it. Well, and if it is, be very careful because you have to be able to prove that there's something from the 1st century following that same thing. So it is a possibility. And there's also a possibility that maybe in the 1500s CE, they were still following that same thing from the first century. And maybe to this day, we're still doing it, but you would have to find the evidence, whether in that manner. You cannot just go in there and say, well, we all wear a kippah today, so Moshe must have wore a kippah. No, he didn't. Moshe did not wear a kippah. Neither did Aharon or any of those guys. That thing did not exist back then. Nope, nope, nope. You guys have heard me talk about that. I've gone as far as I can go. I'm out of time. Shalom and shalom, y'all.